It was a gloomy day. The sky was dark, as if nature had sensed something extraordinary. An uneasiness hung over Mount Golgotha. Among the crowd watching the crucifixion, there was a man. But he wasn't just another spectator. He was a Roman centurion, a battle-hardened leader, used to blood, pain, and death. For him, this was just another day at work, another execution among many others. His mission? To ensure that the crucifixion of 3 condemned men was carried out without interruption. But that day, something unusual was about to happen. Something that would change his life forever. The man hanging on the cross, whom he saw as just another prisoner, was different. He didn't know that this condemned man carried the weight of the spiritual destiny of all humanity. Jesus, the man on the cross, had been accused of blasphemy by the religious leaders. But his presence radiated something unusual. While the crowd shouted insults and jeers, Jesus' demeanor was calm, even serene. He didn't beg, he didn't curse, he didn't resist. His dignity was disconcerting, even for a soldier like that centurion, who had witnessed countless executions over the years. In the praetorium, the centurion watched as the soldiers mocked Jesus. They put a crown of thorns on his head and beat him, laughing and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" It was a common scene for those overseeing crucifixions. But something about Jesus' behavior was striking. He endured everything in silence. There was no hatred in his eyes, no revolt in his words. Imagine for a moment the impact of this. The centurion, used to the desperate resistance of the condemned, was facing someone who was walking towards death with a peace he couldn't explain. As Jesus carried his cross through the narrow streets of Jerusalem, stumbling under the weight, the centurion continued to watch him. When Jesus fell for the 3rd time, he ordered Simon of Cyrene to help him. Not out of compassion, but to ensure that the execution took place without delay. But internally, he began to wonder, who is this man? Why doesn't he react like the others? Arriving at Golgotha, the place called Calvary or Place of the Skull, Jesus was nailed to the cross. Meanwhile, the centurion continued his work. He was used to the shouts, the blasphemies, and the desperate resistance of the prisoners. But Jesus didn't react as expected. Instead he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Those words echoed in the centurion's mind. Forgiveness? For the soldiers who were nailing him to the cross? For the people who mocked him? For the religious leaders who plotted his death? It didn't make sense to the Roman soldier. Then something even stranger happened. The sky suddenly darkened at midday. It wasn't just clouds, it was a supernatural darkness, as if creation itself was in mourning. For 3 hours, the atmosphere became heavy, almost suffocating. The centurion tried to keep his composure, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something divine was happening. Just after darkness, an earthquake shook the ground. The stones shattered, and the Temple of Jerusalem was hit in an inexplicable way. The veil separating the Holy of Holies was torn from top to bottom. For the centurion, this was more than a coincidence. It was as if the world was shouting that something extraordinary had just happened. When Jesus finally gave up his spirit, he said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." The centurion, who had stood firm in the face of so many deaths, could no longer contain his emotions. Observing everything that was happening around him, he made a statement that would change his life forever. Truly, this was the Son of God. This phrase was not said impulsively. It was the result of everything he saw and heard that day. Jesus' silence in the face of torture, his words of forgiveness, the supernatural darkness, and the inexplicable events that occurred after his death. That man, who had started the day as a cold and impartial executioner, was now faced with a truth that shook all his concepts. Who was that prisoner he had helped to crucify? How could he show such compassion and power even at the point of death? Without knowing it, the centurion was embarking on a journey of transformation. And this transformation would begin to change not only his life, but also the way he saw the world and his faith. The story doesn't end here. It continues to show us how even the most hardened hearts can be touched by divine grace. After all, Jesus' impact didn't end at the cross. After the earthquake and the supernatural darkness, the crowd began to disperse, confused and terrified by the day's events. However, the centurion remained there, static, looking at the cross. His heart was restless, his mind confused. He had witnessed many executions before, but never anything like this. Jesus' dignity in the midst of pain, his words of forgiveness, and the unexplained phenomena had completely shaken his beliefs. While the other soldiers collected their equipment and prepared to leave the scene, the centurion couldn't move. He looked up at the sky, which was now beginning to lighten again, but he felt a weight on his chest. The question tormented him: who was that man? That night, the centurion returned home, but the silence around him was deafening. Jesus' words echoed in his mind: "Father, forgive them." Forgiveness was an almost foreign idea to him, a soldier hardened by battles and the brutality of military life. He had killed in the name of Rome, supervised torture, and seen the suffering of many. But he had never witnessed someone who, in the midst of their own agony, chose to forgive their tormentors. In the days that followed, rumors began to spread. Some people said that something extraordinary had happened in the temple. The veil had been torn from top to bottom. Others spoke of the darkness that covered the land and the earthquake as signs that God was involved. But there was an even more impressive rumor. Jesus' body, which had been placed in a tomb, was no longer there. The centurion listened to these reports with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Something inside him told him that this was no hoax or coincidence. He remembered what he had seen and heard on Golgotha: Jesus' serenity, his prayer for his enemies, and that phrase that kept coming to mind: "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." As he tried to process all this, he began to realize that his life would never be the same. He had followed Rome's orders loyally and coolly for years, but now something was changing inside him. He could no longer see the world in the same way. For the first time, he questioned his own life, his actions, and the purpose of his existence. A few days later, the centurion decided to look for answers. He began to hear stories about Jesus, now told by those who had followed him closely. He discovered that Jesus had healed the sick, fed the multitudes, and even raised the dead. But what caught his attention most was hearing that Jesus preached about love, compassion, and redemption. It was something completely opposite to what he had known in his military life. One of the stories that touched him deeply was about how Jesus washed his disciples' feet the night before he was crucified. A leader who served others instead of seeking power? This was unimaginable for a Roman soldier, whose culture exalted strength and dominance. As he heard more accounts, a new reality began to form in his mind. The man he had helped to crucify was not just a prisoner or a rebel. He was someone who transformed lives, even in death. The centurion couldn't escape the feeling that he was being called to something greater. He began to remember his own life, the battles he had fought, the people he had killed, and the emptiness he felt, even after fulfilling his duty with excellence. For the first time, he felt a hope he had never experienced before. Now he understood that the phrase he uttered on Golgotha, "Truly, this was the Son of God," was not just an observation. It was the beginning of a transformation. The hardness of his heart was being broken, and he was beginning to understand that Jesus' message was for everyone, even for him, a war-hardened Roman soldier. After the turbulent days that followed the crucifixion, the centurion decided to seek even more information about the one who had been nailed to the cross. He needed to understand who Jesus was and why his presence had impacted him so deeply. He began to hear stories from followers about the resurrection. Many claimed to have seen Jesus alive, walking among them, with nail marks in his hands and feet, but radiant and full of life. These reports divided him. As a soldier, he was trained to be skeptical and question everything. However, there was something in his heart that pushed him to believe. He remembered the moment when the sky darkened and the earth shook, as if creation itself had witnessed something extraordinary. Now, thinking that Jesus might be alive made sense, even if his mind fought against the idea. The centurion began to discreetly frequent the places where the disciples gathered. He knew that, as a Roman soldier, his presence could cause fear or suspicion, but he also knew that he needed to find answers. As he listened to the accounts of Jesus' miracles, he realized that the man's impact went far beyond what he had witnessed on Golgotha. Jesus didn't just preach about love, he lived it, touching the marginalized, forgiving sinners and bringing hope to those who had lost it. One moment that touched him deeply was hearing about the woman caught in adultery. He was amazed to learn that Jesus, instead of condemning her as everyone expected, simply said, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." This wisdom and compassion challenged everything the centurion understood about justice. For him, strength lay in power and punishment, but now he realized that true strength could lie in mercy and forgiveness. At one of the meetings, he heard about an even more remarkable event: Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples. He was told that Jesus, knowing what was to come, took the bread and wine and used them as symbols of his sacrifice. He said, "This is my body, which is given for you." This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood." The centurion was struck by the idea that Jesus knew what was going to happen, and yet accepted suffering out of love for others. These stories, combined with what he had witnessed on Golgotha, began to shape a new understanding within him. The centurion began to see Jesus not just as an extraordinary man, but as someone divine, someone sent by God to bring a message that he was still learning to understand. One evening, while reflecting on all he had learned, he remembered Jesus' words on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He began to realize that this forgiveness was not only for the soldiers who crucified him, but also for him. As the leader of the execution, he felt a weight of guilt. But now he understood that Jesus' sacrifice was an invitation to forgiveness and redemption, even for someone like him. This revelation was like a ray of light in his darkness. He began to understand that God's love, which Jesus preached, was greater than any fault or sin. This love was unconditional and available even to a Roman centurion, hardened by war and violence. Determined to seek a new purpose, the centurion began to change his actions. He treated his subordinates with more humanity and avoided practices he had previously considered normal, such as abusing prisoners or using unnecessary violence. His transformation did not go unnoticed, and many of those around him began to question what had changed in him. One day, one of Jesus' disciples, noticing the centurion's frequent presence at the meetings, approached him. The centurion, hesitant at first, opened his heart and told what he had experienced on Golgotha and how it had changed him. The disciple listened carefully and with a smile said, "You have seen the Son of God. What you felt is real. Jesus didn't just come for the Jews, but for everyone, including you." These words confirmed what the centurion had already begun to believe. He understood that his life now had a new meaning, and that Jesus' impact on his life was a call to live differently. After his transformation, the centurion began to live with a completely different purpose. He stopped being just a soldier dedicated to duty and became someone who actively sought to reflect the values of love, compassion, and forgiveness that he had learned from Jesus. His life was now a testimony to the power of the cross to change even the most hardened hearts. Rumors of Jesus' resurrection continued to grow, and the centurion began to hear more stories from those who claimed to have seen him alive. Each report strengthened his faith. He no longer had any doubts that he had been part of something much bigger than he had imagined. Golgotha was not just a place of suffering, but the scene of a spiritual victory that would echo for eternity. The centurion began to share his story with other soldiers and people in his community. He talked about what he had witnessed on the day of the crucifixion, the serenity of Jesus, the words of forgiveness, and the impact of the supernatural signs. He also talked about his own change, about how that day had profoundly transformed him. Some mocked him, calling him naive. Others, however, listened attentively, intrigued by the sincerity of his words. It didn't matter to him. He knew that his calling was to spread the message of redemption that he had experienced. Over time, the centurion joined other followers of Jesus. Although he still faced challenges from his position as a Roman soldier, he found ways to live out his faith while continuing in his role. He came to see his role of leading and protecting not as a position of power, but as an opportunity to serve and guide with justice and compassion. His spiritual journey also led him to seek deeper answers in the scriptures. He dedicated himself to understanding the teachings of Jesus and the prophecies that pointed to him as the Messiah. With each new discovery, his faith grew stronger, and he felt an even greater desire to live according to the values he had learned. One of the most remarkable moments of his new life came when he had the opportunity to console a fellow soldier who was facing doubts and anguish. The centurion shared his story, talking about the power of forgiveness and God's grace that he had experienced. This deeply touched the heart of his colleague, who began to seek the same transformation. The centurion's impact continued to grow, not because he sought recognition, but because his life was living proof that no one is beyond the reach of God's love. He demonstrated that the cross was not just a historical event, but an opportunity for change for everyone who surrendered to God's call. As we reflect on this story, we are reminded that the power of the cross is real and transformative. Just as the centurion had his life changed by recognizing who Jesus really was, we too can experience that same transformation. Jesus' sacrifice was for all of us, regardless of who we are or what we have done. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to take a step of faith today. Allow the love of Jesus to transform your life, just as it transformed the life of that Roman centurion. If you felt this message resonate in your soul, don't hesitate to find out more about what it means to live with purpose and hope. If you liked this video, Leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more content like this. Also, take the opportunity to watch another video that's popping up on your screen right now. Thank you for being here, and may God bless your life abundantly. See you next time.